All right, so our boy Ben Shapiro, the right-wing propagandist over at the Daily Wire, is back at it again with the hot takes. This time, he is going to explain to us how the concept of a living wage simply does not exist in the United States. Okay, so we're going to have to run through this 40-second clip. I'm going to have to pause a couple of times throughout this, but let's just go ahead and hear what he has to say here.
Well, I mean, first of all, the wage to cost of living gap would not exist in the absence of regulation and subsidy.
Okay, so that's a thought, right? Okay, so basically what he's arguing there is that if you implemented sort of Reaganomics on steroids to the maximum extent possible, and I guess just completely gutted government regulations, slash taxes for the wealthy, help to dismantle labor unions and things like that, increased privatization of various industries, and just allow the free market, or the so-called free market under capitalism, to thrive and flourish, and for capitalists to be able to do whatever they want, right? If you were to do all of those things, somehow that would eliminate these problems with a lack of so-called living wages, or increase the living standards for average working class Americans. I mean, we are living in the year 2023 at this point, and he is still trying to make arguments from like the 1980s that have already been demonstrable failures, not just in the United States, but around the entire world that is adapted to the neoliberal economic order. So just a couple of things here, a couple of interesting data points to give you guys in this kind of a circumstance with the arguments that he's putting forward here. First of all, okay, since Ronald Reagan, since the sort of the popularization of this neoliberal economic order that we still maintain to this day, we have seen what exactly, okay, with the gutting of deregulations and subsidies and things like that Ben was just referencing there. Well, since about 1979, pretty much exactly the year where Ronald Reagan got elected to the presidency, we have seen a complete decoupling of wages and productivity. So how did that happen? Could it potentially have something to do with, again, the privatization of industries, the deregulations of those industries, increasing the amount of power and wealth that the top 1%, the top 0.1% have over our economy, while dismantling collective worker power? Could that have something potentially to do with the decoupling of wages and productivity, and how wages have been stagnating over the last couple of decades? In the words of Ben Shapiro, I guess not. We also have this data, as well as pointed out here by the Intelligencer. They show the top 1% versus the bottom 50% of the share of national income in the United States compared to Western European sort of social democracies that they have over there. So here in the US, again, since the 1980s, in the era of the type of economic policies that Ben is, arguing for here full-throatedly, you can see that basically we've had the share of national income for the bottom half of the American people plummet from around 22% or so, or 21%, I guess, which is still not even enough compared to, the amount of output in terms of the value of their labor that they are putting into the system, but still around 21% back during the early 1980s. And then we see a plummeting towards closer to today in 2015, 2016, where it is now down at about 13% of the national income. Meanwhile, we have seen the top 1% in this country absolutely skyrocket in their share of the national income, all the way down from less than 12% to, at this point, above 20% of the national income. Okay, and this isn't even getting into other conversations about wealth and other forms that the billionaire and millionaire class stash their wealth in this country. But then you contrast that to some countries in Western Europe, where they actually do have a lot more of the basic necessities met for their constituents, for their people over there, even though of course they have their own flaws. But I mean, just compared to Western Europe, I mean, the bottom 50% in Western Europe, their share of the national wealth, I mean, it's stuck up there close to 24, 23% and maintained somewhat steadily. You have the bottom 1%. It's gone up somewhat slightly, but it's still maintained at least to a little bit. We've also talked about this statistic so many different times on this channel, but there was a study that was recently done just a couple of years ago, back during 2020, where they show here from Time magazine that the top 1% of Americans over the last couple of decades in the neoliberal era have taken $50 trillion from the bottom 90%. And they say that that's made the U.S. less secure. You don't say, okay? The top 1% of Americans have taken $50 trillion from the bottom 90%. That mathematically equals out to about $1,400 a month in the pockets of every single American during these last couple of decades that has basically been looted from their pockets and, sent off to Wall Street ghouls. But that is the kind of economic framework that Ben Shapiro is basically arguing would solve the issues that we have right now with a lack of so-called living wages. Okay, but he's going to continue here, and it's going to get even worse.
At least not nearly as much. The fact of the matter is that one of the reasons you have housing shortages in blue areas is because of development restrictions that are largely created by the left. The reason that you have...
Okay, we're just going to have to pause on that housing point because, yeah, of course, in some places they go overboard with, housing regulations and all of that, and you could make some arguments surrounding that. But at the end of the day, the problem right now in the United States in relation to the issue of homelessness or the housing market right now, it is primarily being driven by the commodification of the housing industry, right? We do not treat housing as a human right in this country. We treat it as an investment vehicle. We treat it as, basically a commodity that is to be bought and sold and traded. We now have, I just saw a couple recent reports from my home city of Atlanta, where basically Wall Street firms like BlackRock and Vanguard are gobbling up, in some cases, upwards of like 25% of the single family homes within the city of Atlanta. And they were doing that not for, the sake of the American people or to better the housing market. They are trying to monopolize this industry, gain as much control over the housing market as they physically and legally can get away with, and then price gouging people for rent while pushing average Americans out of the housing market. This is why I frequently say that, in large part, the original idea of the American dream is dead at this point because most people from my generation are never going to be able to afford housing. And that's not because just specifically about like woke liberal housing, regulations or zoning policies or something like that, which I do have critiques of. I think that we should be zoning for a lot more like multifamily, not single family homed zoning, areas and, zoning for affordable housing in certain areas and low income housing and all of that. I actually think we should be building socialized housing as well in this country, similar to how they've pulled off in Austria, for example. But, his critique basically is that we should, I guess, remove all regulations from the housing market, continue to allow Wall Street ghouls to gobble up this market and then, price gouge people over rent while average Americans can't even afford to, get into the housing market in any way, shape, or form. So again, it's like he's calling out issues that, yes, average Americans are facing in regards to not being able to afford housing, but he turns around and pretends as if capitalism or unregulated capitalism is going to be the solution to this problem when it is in fact the biggest issue, the problem causer of what we're actually talking about right here. It's just amazing.
Massive inflation right now is, again, because of left-wing financial policy. It tends to be that wages move in tandem with costs, generally speaking, because, again, there is no such thing as a non-living wage. Nobody dies on their wage. And that is not a thing that happens inside the United States. This is why when people say living wage, the question is, well, what do you mean by a non-living wage? Do you just mean a wage that you don't think is high enough? And for what job? And what does the market look like? Well,
Okay, so basically the two different things that he, pushes there at the end of this clip. Number one, he's talking about, of course, inflation and pretending as if we don't have access to the data surrounding this issue and what have actually been the primary drivers of inflation. I've talked about it probably a dozen times on this channel before. We know the data on this. We know the statistics on this. Inflation during the last couple of years has been primarily an outright majority of it driven by pure corporate greed. It is because corporations decided it was a good moment for them to price gouge the American people for things like food and gas and other basic necessities because nobody was going to stop them, okay? That's the primary driver of inflation. If you're talking about wages, if you're talking about all of these other associated costs, even supply chain issues, which were a significant factor, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, but they do not compare to the corporate greed that has been driving inflation. And there is no evidence whatsoever that, these spending packages that Congress put forward are the direct cause cause of inflation. I mean, it's just, they're like, lizard brained when it comes to talking about these kinds of economic issues. It's like, oh, government spent money, therefore money supply go up, therefore inflation happens. And it's like, no, that's not actually how it works. There are efficient ways to use deficit spending. There are inefficient ways to use deficit spending. But, these packages that were passed during COVID to give like breadcrumbs to, average working class Americans as they were being fired or furloughed or, having all these other tangential issues as a result of the pandemic, that is not what was driving inflation, believe it or not. And that is just a verifiable fact that Ben Shapiro refuses to, incorporate into his analysis, which is just amazing because this is coming from the so-called facts and feelings guy, even though none of what he's saying here is actually based on facts. It is all based on his own personal feelings, right? And then the other thing that he talks about there is basically, again, the concept that the living wage simply does not exist. Well, I'd have some counter examples here, just in a second. But first of all, I'd like to say that, Ben Shapiro, when he's sitting there in his Daily Wire studio, $1 million studio or whatever the fuck that is, funded by millionaires and billionaires that help to fund the Daily Wire as he does pro-capitalist propaganda on their behalf. When he's sitting there and he's making this confused argument about, oh, well, what do you really mean by a living wage? Nobody can define it or something like that. It's like, no, we have definitions of a living wage, right? We mean, people being able to work a full-time job and being able to meet the basic necessities without having to make unnecessary cuts to the food intake that they have, to, spending more than they should be, roughly like a third of their income on housing, for example, or just being able to maintain a stable and comfortable life, right? There are multiple different metrics you could look at in making that analysis, and some people might come up with slightly different numbers, but at the end of the day, we have an answer to that question. It's not some amorphous thing that nobody has defined ever, and Ben Shapiro is thinking that, like, what? I guess that when leftists talk about the fact that we do not have living wages in this country, that means that we think that, like, Thor is going to come down and strike down poor people with lightning and like blow them up into shards and they're going to instantly die or something like that, or that people are literally like starving, physically starving on the streets because they're working a full-time job that doesn't pay them enough to have enough food intake. It's like, that's just a ridiculous straw man of what the actual conversation is about. When we're talking about living wages, again, it's pretty simple. It's just being able to meet your basic life necessities: healthcare, education, food costs, housing costs, being able to take care of your family, etc., right? That's what we're talking about, with a comfortable cushion in there, for people to actually be able to go out and, believe it or not, enjoy their lives. Now, the minimum wage we currently have in this country, $7.25 an hour, just as one example, okay? I've shown you guys the studies on this before, but we have 0 counties in the entire United States where somebody who is working a full-time job could afford a 2-bedroom apartment, presumably for themselves, and maybe they have a kid or something like that. 0 counties where they can afford a 2-bedroom apartment in the United States on a minimum wage salary without having to pay more than what the federal guidelines say that you should be paying for rent. Okay, so that's just one example. That's what we mean when we say it's not a living wage. It's because you are going to have to make cutbacks in other portions of your monthly budget in order to just get by and keep a roof over your head, right? It doesn't mean you are going to instantly blow up into a flame ball and perish as a direct result of your wage or something like that. It just means it's not a comfortable living wage, right? People are barely scraping by. Vast majority of the American people are living paycheck to paycheck. You could be one step removed from some sort of a medical emergency that could bankrupt you or your family, where you could lose everything through no fault of your own. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about a lack of living wages or labor protections as well. But just to give one specific example, because I wanted to basically give a response to the straw man even that he's putting forward here, that nobody dies as a result of their wages. Again, it's not like, yeah, you're going to instantly explode into a million pieces, but people do die as a result of wages that are far too low to keep themselves maintained with some of their life necessities that they need. Just one example here, over 1 million Americans are rationing insulin due to the high cost of this. Now, you could give multiple different analyses here and talk about the pharmaceutical industry, the fact that our government is allowing them to price gouge average Americans. Biden put in place some sort of a marginal cap. I think it's $35 a month for insulin costs, specifically for people who are on Medicare, right? It's pretty limited. It's sort of like a neoliberal half-assed measure that he's put forward here. But again, Do you think that this doesn't have real life or death consequences for the millions of Americans that are rationing insulin? Is that not a potential threat to their life? Or how about just this in a broader scope way, right? Because this is just one specific example here, right? We could also talk about, increased safety, safety dangers that people are faced as a result of living in poverty, or, unstable housing measures, or so many other things that we could talk about when it comes to, lowering the life expectancy of, average working class Americans relative to what they actually could be if we lived in a more functioning and democratic society. But to basically encapsulate all of that, I mean, again, he says in this clip very definitively, there is no such thing as a living wage. Nobody ever dies as a result of their wages in the glorious United States of America. Well, let's look at some of the data here, okay? Life expectancy versus income in the United States. Okay, so if there were no potential direct life or death consequences for people's wages, or for the fact that people are living in poverty in this country, then how do you explain this? Okay, I mean, again, for women, who of course always have a lot higher life expectancy than men, okay, that has been consistent for decades and decades and decades now, but it goes across, different genders here. They say women from the bottom 1% in the United States, the poorest Americans, presumably with the lowest wages or no wages at all, they have a life expectancy on average of 78.8 years. Women in the top 1%, the richest among us, live 10 years longer on average at 88.9. Same goes for men. It's an even wider gap here. Men from the bottom 1% in this country in terms of income, 72.3 years on average. Men in the top 1%, 87.3. That's a 15 or some odd gap between the poorest 1% and the richest 1% in terms of income in the United States compared to what their actual life expectancy is. Okay, so I mean, again, it's not surprising to see some sort of a stupid fucking take like this from a billionaire apologist like Ben Shapiro, from one of the classic examples of a bootlicking capitalist that you could ask for in terms of right-wing propagandists in this country. But I mean, understand, not only is it just grotesque that he's pretending as if people aren't legitimately struggling in this country as a direct result of them being underpaid for the value of their labor, but he's also trying to reinforce the same economic, hegemonic, ideological framework that has been in place for decades in this country and has been absolutely destroying working class Americans.
Everyone is saying good Politic guy has the best Politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying